Well, welcome. My name is Carol Canavan, and I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Canton. And I'm joined by my colleague, Diane DiGianantonio. I think she's probably still back around the corner. She's the other co-president. We have a wonderful panel for you tonight, but before we get started with that, I would like to recognize the fact that we have a number of school people that are here. And we're so thankful that you are here to hear about this. You know about it. I'm sure you're here partly to check out how we're talking about it. And we hope to have you go back to your school districts and energize the people in your district. So, Jeff Talbot, would you start, introduce yourself, what your role is, what school system, and we'll just go through the back row. And all the people who are representing schools tonight, we'd like to have you stand up and be recognized. Over here. Are there other board or principals or? Okay. Well, we are so very glad you're here, and that's extra emphasis on our subject tonight, which is saving public schools. Very important. So let me just begin with my prepared remarks. As most of you know, the League of Women Voters is a very old organization founded when the 19th Amendment finally came into place. The women who had been suffragists finally, after 70 years of struggle, got the right to vote. And then they realized in getting the right to vote, well, you got to know what you're voting about, right? So they began providing educational programs for people out there in the public to learn what they should consider as they consider candidates. Not telling them how to vote, but telling them what the pros and cons are, or allowing them to hear candidates speak for themselves. And that is something that we are very proud of, and that we continue that work to this day. We do have an arm of the organization which advocates for certain things, but we never advocate for issues unless they have been studied and thoroughly vetted. An example of that is we are anti-gerrymandering, as you probably have heard. We've been anti-gerrymandering since the 70s, when the other party was in charge of the drawing the maps, and they were not drawing very good maps either. We do believe in the voter, but we believe that the voter needs the right to feel like their vote is going to be counted. And that's really what our struggle against gerrymandering is all about. If you have fair districts for certain candidates, they really don't care what you think, and you don't have an opportunity to kick them out of office, as is supposed to happen in a democracy. So that's one of our strong things that we work on. I'm joined tonight, in addition to our wonderful school people, by other members of our league, as you've seen them running around the room. I'd like to recognize in particular my partners in this process, Donna Plunkett in the back, Peggy Ingalls here, and not quite so far back. The three of us have worked on these two school projects. And of course, Diane, our co-president, has been the person who started this whole issues program group and has worked tirelessly to get us going on all of these various ways in which we can help educate you, the public. There are several things, because the League has been doing these programs for so many years, there are several things we've developed as sort of rules of the road. And the first of them is to please turn your phone off. If you have a phone that is turned off, but you still have alarms set on it, as I am guilty, and the alarms, surprise, surprise, they happen even if your phone is silenced. So please consider just turning it flat out off. We don't allow taking pictures or video during the panel. This is all being recorded. And because it's being recorded, it will be posted on our website in the next day or two. And the people here in this facility are fabulous. We were amazed at how quickly they turned around the last video that they did for us. We will have a Q&A after this, after the panelists have had their opportunity to speak. And you probably found an index card on your seat, and if you have a question you want to ask, if you want to direct it to a specific person, please write that on your card as well, and we will pick those up before the Q&A begins. So, let's start with our program. This is the second part of our series, Saving Public Schools. The first one was on honesty in education, and I think a number of you here in the audience were here. Now we're talking about school funding. You know, more than 25 years ago, the Supreme Court of the state of Ohio ruled that Ohio's way of funding its schools was unconstitutional. 25 years, more than 25 years, we haven't fixed it yet. We're wondering, I mean, some of you may wonder why we keep hearing, oh, this school district or that school district, oh, they're going back to their citizens and asking for another levy to be passed. Perhaps that's because a lot of money is being siphoned off from public schools to be put into the hands of parents who want to send their children to private schools. And of course, they always started out with a really good excuse for this. Well, we had underperforming schools. You know, parents need to have the opportunity to choose. But it seems like more and more, as you're going to learn, there's a lot of money that's going out there into the pockets of parents who are sending their kids. And maybe they need the money, and maybe they don't need it as much as they'd like us to believe. So we have 4 panelists. I'm going to name them briefly, and then Susie Kaeser is going to lead us off. Susie is the League of Women Ohio's issues specialist on public school finance. Steve Dyer is the founder and president of Education Policy Solutions. Brent May is the superintendent of Plain Local Schools, and Eric Resnick is the Canton City School District on the Board of Education. So I think we have 4 very qualified individuals, and they're going to help us understand the ins and outs of school funding in Ohio, and especially the damage the voucher system is doing. Thank you. Susie?
Thank you all for being here tonight to think about school funding, vouchers, and saving public education, 3 closely connected concerns. Public education is fundamental to democracy, equal citizenship, strong communities, and life opportunities for the next generation. I hope that I can add something to your understanding of these issues and of the urgent need to fight hard for our amazing resource, our system of public education. Now you can do slide 2. The League of Women Voters is all about democracy. I'm thrilled to be associated with an organization that includes as one of its basic principles that all people should have access to a free public education. For the League, it's right up there with voting rights. We have multiple positions on lots of issues, but we have several positions, as Carol described, related to education. They have to do with including the needs for adequate and equitable school funding, the use of public education funds exclusively for public education, the need for elected boards of education to provide oversight on the use of public education funds, and that high-stakes testing is a misuse of standardized tests. These are core positions, and we advocate strongly around all of them, and they relate very much to tonight's conversation. The founders believe that an educated electorate is essential to democracy working. Leaving access to education up to individuals would not ensure that every person would have access to high-quality education. So every state constitution, including Ohio's, makes funding a system of public education a primary responsibility of state government. In fact, it's the only responsibility where funding is actually named in the Constitution. We are all the beneficiaries of having an educated electorate. So education supports the common good. It isn't about satisfying individual desires. It is not a consumer item. Despite the deep roots and central role of our system of public education, I am terrified that it is in need of defense. We need to save public education. Over my 40 years of working as a public school advocate, as a citizen of my community, I've watched with horror the change from education being a nonpartisan issue where policymakers focused on making the system effective for all into a weapon for political gain. I never thought I'd see the day when our system of public education, the cornerstone of every community and a viable, valuable social education infrastructure, would ever feel fragile. But I feel at this moment in time, it is fragile. So instead of working on how to improve my community, which has been the focus of most of my advocacy over time, I decided to step up into this position for the State League and focus on state policy. If you love your local schools, you just have to pay attention to the state legislature at this time in history. Unfortunately, while the Ohio Constitution gives the legislature responsibility for funding a high-quality system of public schools, lawmakers are failing to fund the public system and leading the charge to weaken it by supporting private options and making it hard for educators to do their jobs. That means that those of us who care about our public schools must not only focus locally, but we have to pay attention. It can be a hard shift to make, but I urge you to, if you love your local schools, be sure to get involved in state policy. Next slide. While high-stakes testing and censorship are undermining our system, the legislature's obsession with privatizing this public good is a fundamental threat to our education tradition and the reason it was put in the Constitution in the first place. It is a major ideological shift that undermines democracy. The change began in 1996, the year before the Ohio Supreme Court in the Duralf case found that our funding system was not adequate or equitable. At that time, the legislature allowed for a pilot project in Lucas County that was to create charter schools. It was in 1996 that the legislature created its first voucher program, which is the Cleveland Scholarship Program, and 1997 allowed the pilot project in Toledo that allowed for private organizations to create charter schools. Instead of adequately funding the public system for the benefit of all children, the legislature chose to fund private alternatives. This was the start of a long, expensive journey toward operating two different school systems, one public, inclusive, highly regulated, accountable, and transparent, and one private, selective, unregulated, unaccountable, and opaque. It was innocent at first, a pilot project to spark innovation, a rescue mission for a few kids stuck in the Cleveland public schools. It has since then gone off the rails. Right now, there is a bill pending that would make all education funded by vouchers and abandon the very idea of a public system and the common good. So we have three different mechanisms in Ohio that allow privatizing this public good. The first, of course, is vouchers. And people are a little confused about this sometimes, so I just thought it'd be important to redefine them for you. So vouchers are tuition scholarships to existing private schools. Schools have to agree to accept voucher students, and not all do. Those that do accept voucher students do not accept all applicants. The scholarships are not based on need or merit. They are free money to cover the cost of private education. Most are used for access to religious schools. Once a student receives a voucher, they are entitled to renew it all the way through, all the way through their education, unless they move. Vouchers started as the decline in enrollment in many of the parochial schools had become quite problematic. This was during George Voinovich's tenure as governor. It was meant to help sustain these failing institutions. And as Steve Dyer has recently documented, private enrollment continues to decline. So the second option are charter schools. These are publicly funded but privately operated schools and were promoted as a way to spark innovation. The current law gives all kinds of organizations, including for-profit management companies, the authority to operate a school. The tuition level is the same as for EdChoice vouchers. There are currently 315 charter schools in Ohio. Some are online and some are bricks and mortar. They have been especially prone to fraud and corruption. The legislature resists any proposals to regulate them. They siphon off public school students, often resulting in the closing of public schools. And the newest option are tax credits for homeschooling and for education savings accounts. Next one. So the focus here is on vouchers. There are 5 different programs, each targeting a different population. 3 are narrowly focused. The Cleveland Scholarship Program was for Cleveland kids. The autism is specifically for children with that diagnosis, and the Peterson scholarships are for children with special education needs outside of autism. So, but EdChoice and EdChoice expansion were designed to reach the general population of students. EdChoice expansion is an income-based program making vouchers available to anyone under 200% of poverty level at the start. Now it's at 250. Has it gone higher?
They want to make it 400.
They're headed towards 400. So there are many ways that this gets expanded. You start small, you get your toehold in, and slowly over time, it has exploded.
$110,000 a year for a family of 4.
Yeah.
So 400%.
The original EdChoice program was justified as a way to help kids escape failing schools. It was a lifeboat approach for some kids and ignored the needs of the rest. Test scores are used to define which schools are failures. Initially, only students enrolled in those schools were eligible for a voucher. This quickly changed to anyone who lived in the attendance area of that school. And I want to comment on the use of test scores to define success or failure of schools. It's seriously flawed. We know that they are a better measure of economic status of the test taker than of the quality of the education that students receive. So it's no surprise that when I studied the distribution of vouchers in 2019, 90% of EdChoice vouchers went to 20 school districts that were high poverty and mostly non-white. Until the last budget, when the state took over fully funding vouchers, the local school district had to fund part of the cost of those vouchers, taking funds away from the neediest students in the state. It is unconscionable. Next slide. So vouchers are expensive, and the state invests more in voucher recipients than public school students. It's on a per pupil basis, I should say. So it's important to note that the base cost, that's the floor, the amount of money we guarantee every public school student in the state, and is funded in a partnership with the local school district, is $6,010. And once the Fair School Funding Plan is fully funded, it should reach about $7,100. But because the base cost is a shared responsibility with local communities, the average amount that the state contributes is only $4,008 for public school students, compared to $7,500 for voucher students or $31,000 in special needs students. I live in Cleveland Heights. In my community, we have about 5,000 public school students and more than 1,800 voucher students. And most of them, less than 100, I think it's like 75 of them, of our voucher students left the public schools. This is a private school subsidy program. So in fiscal year 2022, our district received about $5.6 million for our 5,000 students, while $11 million were spent on the voucher students in our community. There's something really wrong here. The next slide. Given the legislature's clear preference for private education, a coalition of school districts has filed suit in Franklin County Common Pleas Court challenging the constitutionality of funding two systems of education, and we have core participants in that lawsuit here, and I think you'll hear more from them. This case, unlike the first case that challenged vouchers on the separation of church and state, focuses on funding. Given gerrymandering, it's hard to see any other way to stop the privatization of public education that is diminishing the public system. Every board of education should join this lawsuit. Our local school districts are the public education system that is being destroyed. And I've created a handout for school administrators on some reasons why you should join it, if you haven't. But it's really, to me, what we as citizens need to advocate with our school boards, if they haven't joined, that this is a priority, that they've got to get on board. The last one. So what do we do? We are at a very interesting moment in history because the first time in 25 years we have a viable remedy to our funding needs. The Fair School Funding Plan, if fully funded, would actually meet the constitutional requirement for adequacy and equity. It means about a $2 billion a year increase in the funding that's now going into public schools. And in the last budget, they made a commitment to about a third of that, but it isn't permanent. It isn't clear that we'll ever get fully funded. They also cut taxes, expanded vouchers, increased the per pupil spending on private options. So there's no guarantee at all. How are the public schools going to fare in competition with this privatization movement? So this is also the moment when a supermajority legislature could fully privatize education. They have the ability to do that. And with gerrymandering, they have no obligation to represent the interests of their community. So in 2023, when a new General Assembly comes back to work on the state budget, they have another chance to solve school funding. This is not just an education issue. It is a community issue. The viability of our communities depends on high-quality public schools. We all know that's important to attracting people and keeping them, and on a fair tax burden for local property owners. And as long as the state fails to hold up its end of the deal in the shared responsibility for funding our public system, local communities and taxpayers will suffer. It creates terrible tension in communities. I go through it every time. We have a lot of tax levies in our community, and most people feel tapped out. They're suspicious of their school boards. And if there's anything we need, it is trusting relationships in our communities about our schools. So the unwillingness of the legislature to fully fund our public schools really is detrimental to communities. The plan is right, but funding it will be an uphill fight. There are likely to be fewer legislators who are committed to the public purpose of public education. The strongest champions for the plan, Cupp and Patterson, will no longer be in the legislature. Patterson is no longer there, and Cupp will be done in December. And gerrymandering continues to get in the way of fairly representing our students. So saving public education and saving the Fair School Funding Plan is going to take all of us. We can name the problem we are facing. This is dire. We are facing something profound. The future of public education and of democracy really are on the line. We need to focus our energy on state policy. While most of us think of public education as the schools in our communities, they are the state system. And it is state policy regarding that system that is making it hard to offer our students what they need. You can't love your schools without fighting for fair school funding and limits on privatization. We need to reject the public school failure narrative. It's a thinly veiled rationale for privatizing. We need better schools. We don't need to dismantle them. We need to fund them. And we need to reject the call for choice. In this case, choice is another word for individual rights and a rejection of the common good. When it comes to education, we need a strong public system that serves everyone, unites our diverse publics, and is accountable to elected boards of education. Privatizing simply divides us. Get your school district to join the voucher lawsuit. Voucher funding affects every district. In the past, it didn't. Now it does. The money's in the same pot with the public school funding. We just have to see this as a threat to the system itself. And every member of the Ohio House and half of the Senate are up for election in November. We need legislators who believe in public education. Find out where your candidates stand on public schools. Go to the mat for the Fair School Funding Plan when the legislature convenes in January. Adoption will be a huge benefit to every community and every person who pays property taxes. Stand up for teachers and students. It's something every one of us can do in every way we know how to do it. We've got to help them stay the course. They make education work. So thank you for listening, and I'm glad to turn this to Steve Dyer, who knows the details of all of this.
Okay. Thank you, Susie. Hi, everybody. I know several of you, but not all of you, as I should. Prior to what I'm doing now, I was a legislator in the State House. I represented Southern Portage and Summit counties, and I was chair of the Primary and Secondary Education Subcommittee on the House Finance Committee in 2009 when I rewrote the state school funding formula that looks very similar to the Fair School Funding Plan, but of course. Governor Kaeser got rid of that when he came into office. But so I'm very familiar with how these things work in Columbus, and I can tell you that Susie's words are absolutely true. Everybody, and what else is sadly true is that there's an old axiom in Ohio: nobody ever lost an election because they cut money to schools, and they should. They should lose elections over that. They start losing elections over that. Guess what? They're not going to cut money to schools anymore. But until that happens, it's going to be problematic. So let's talk a little bit about why and how Ohio legislators, especially in the last 15 years, have really doubled and tripled and quadrupled and over 100%ed down on school choice, especially vouchers. This is the percentage of the state budget that's going to K-12 education over the years. And as you can see, in 1975, it was a little over 45% of the state budget. And now we're looking at somewhere around 40%. So the commitment to public education, K-12 public education overall, generally is not where it was in 1975. And it is, as you can see, the deep crater that happened around the time of the first school funding lawsuit inspired some introspection, perhaps, on behalf of the legislature to actually invest. But now that the money is going, now that we're back up to, we were down to 35, now we're around 40. The problem is there's not a lot less of that is actually going to what we think of as public schools. Here's another interesting chart. In 1994-95, 54% of the money for public education came from local property taxes. And this is right in the middle of the school funding lawsuit. One of the two tenets of it was that we relied too much on property taxes to pay for schools. So as you can see, it narrowed right around the time of the Droff case. So it got pretty close. And then once the Supreme Court dropped jurisdiction over the Droff case in 2002 because there were new members coming on who were probably find that it was constitutional, so the court just dropped the case. It expanded again, and then lo and behold, when Governor Strickland took over and when we had divided government between the parties in the House and the Senate side, it not only narrowed for 1 year. I'm proud to say the year of one of my school funding plan. The only time on record there was more state than local revenue going into public education. Now, it wasn't by a lot, but it was there. So we were actually headed on the right path, and now we're back to actually worse than where we were in the DeRolf times. So that's not good. But if you notice something here, this is the amount of money going to charter and voucher programs since it started in 1996. And as you can see, it wasn't very big at first, you know, just kind of the old camel's nose in the tent thing. Really expand, and it's especially expanded since 2010, and it's just a steady march up that chart. We are probably going to be at about $1.6 billion for charters and vouchers this last school year. The finalized data hasn't come out yet for vouchers, but we're probably in the $1.6 billion range for charters and vouchers together now. And we've spent, since the beginning of the programs, we've spent $18 billion on privately run charters and tuition subsidies since 1996. Can you imagine what we would do in the public schools with that? The change, especially since between 2010 and 2021, it looks like, oh, we haven't increased money to charters a whole lot. Well, yeah, we have. It's almost 50% increase over the last 10 years. But look at that increase to vouchers. It has been an explosion of voucher money over the last decade or so, and that's because they keep expanding it. They keep increasing per pupil funding, so that it's just an inexorable march to more and more money going to these options. And here's what I was talking about. This is how much money is going to the K-12 budget, and what percentage of that is going to the traditional K-12 schools. And as you can see, the red line is where it's going to public schools, and the difference between that and the blue line is charter and voucher payments. So when you take out the charter and voucher payments, we're actually, under about $7 billion a year now going to K-12 traditional schools, which, if you adjust for inflation, is actually less than what we were doing in 1997 when the first school funding case came out and said it was unconstitutional. So it's while it looks like there's a lot more money going to public education than there used to be, you got to dig into the numbers to see it's not going where you think it's going. All right? Funding to public education has essentially remained flat for 25 years because of the investment in public and privately run charters and tuition subsidies for private school students. And there's the difference. In 1997 inflation-adjusted dollars, we're looking at over $8 billion going to public schools. Now we're looking at, about $7.7 billion. So it's actually less money, effectively, than what was going to traditional public schools in the 1997 year. So what should a school funding model look like? Well, it should pay for things, right, that kids need, like teachers, specialist teachers, lead teachers, special education teachers, family community liaisons, go figure, guidance counselors, summer remediation, administrators, principals. These are things that that schools and students need to pay for. This is what some in the anti-public education world call an inputs-based funding system. This was the evidence-based model of school funding that I drafted in 2009, where we actually tried to figure out what do kids need, how do we pay for it, and what's the cost. Oh my God, go figure. But again, the legislature has always been afraid of big numbers. unless it comes in the form of a tax cut, then they love it. But in terms of spending money, they are afraid of big numbers. They're always afraid of the actual cost. They know it costs a lot of money to educate kids. They're just trying to find shortcuts to do it. And this is what a school funding model generally looks like if you're looking for something that's fair and equitable. We're not the only one who does this. Wyoming did it. Wyoming, the most conservative state in the country, that threw out Liz Cheney, right? They have had a version of the evidence-based model since 2005. And again, they fund a lot of the same elements, and they have effectively increased their state aid by a couple thousand bucks per student. And they've also increased the share coming from the state versus local, which is what we were supposed to do. And there's their per pupil state aid that's increased over the years that they've had it. And here's something else that's interesting. In 2010, when we had the first year of the evidence-based model, Ohio was the 5th rated state in the country, according to Education Week's Quality Counts report. Now we're down in the mid-20s. Meanwhile, Wyoming went from down in the mid-30s up to number 7, and that's where they've stayed, primarily on the strength of their funding model and their funding commitment. This is Wyoming, okay? Most conservative state in the country, according to Gallup. So they can do it, why can't we? And again, here's the Fair School Funding Plan. Looks very similar, right? Funding things that actually kids need, and we've tried to figure out what they need. We're going to fund it. But it's only a third of the way funded. Need about $1 billion more over the next 4 years. Charter and vouchers come out of the same budget line, and any money for choice options before it's fully funded means you can't fulfill the promise of the Fair School Funding Plan. So any money that goes to school, that goes to charters and vouchers, eliminates the possibility of fully funding the Fair School Funding Plan. The backpack bill is, or universal voucher bill, whatever you want to call it, is money following the child on steroids. It gives everyone a fixed amount to spend on anything they want. Homeschooling, some crazy book that tells you that, people rode dinosaurs, whatever. You get public money for that. And there's no public oversight. And this is what the Ohio Senate wants to do for school funding. I have no doubt in my mind that they will offer this as the Senate version of school funding. So if you have any questions, there's my contact number, and then I'll hand it over to Brent, who doesn't have a PowerPoint.
Well, good evening, and thanks for being here tonight. As was introduced earlier, this is my 13th year as superintendent in the Plain Local School District here in Stark County, and just appreciate people's attention to this topic. And I guess my comments will start out this way. I'm not here to complain. I'm here to shed some light on what's going on and to educate people on what really is happening in Columbus. And so I'm going to echo some things. I don't need a PowerPoint because really all the slides I'm going to talk about. So the first point I'm going to talk about tonight is the backpack bill, House Bill 290. And, when we talk about this bill, and I agree with Steve and what he said, this is the next funding formula in Ohio. And it's set to begin next year. Most people aren't aware of that. And if you have some time, I was able to watch the testimony that was given on this bill, and there were very few answers given about how it was going to be financed and also the accountability around it. So the details go something like this. One, the Ohio Treasurer's Office is heavily involved with the writing of this bill. The legislators who introduced it had very little details. Couldn't explain it, other than every family should have choice, and that the bill is pro-student, pro-family. And I believe that's what public education is about, for all, not just some. So a lot of it, as I said, is still unclear, but some of the details are alarming. It creates an educational savings account for a family. It's $5,500 for a student in grades K through 8, and it's $7,500 for a family in grades 9 through 12. So that's a savings account that you can use those dollars for whatever you want. Tutoring, homeschooling, after school, summer school. And the interesting part about this is what public schools already do. We offer these programming free of charge for most of them. We bus kids in all summer. We educate them. We feed them. And we do all the things to connect with families. So all citizens of Ohio will have their tax dollar go towards vouchers. So, people want to split hairs and talk about, well, the state share, the local share. At the end of the day, there is one line item for education in Ohio. So the dollars are going to go away from public school children. So the result of that is districts and communities will have to ask for more money. And now's not a good time to be doing that. These also are tax-free dollars for families. These vouchers, as I said, no accountability financially or academically. And they testified and they said, the representatives, that they will do biannual testing. Well, biannual testing, I think we all know what that means. All we do in a public school is test, because it's mandated by the state of Ohio. So if you look at any district in this room and their testing calendar, our kids are constantly being tested. So they're going to do biannual testing, and I'll get into how you qualify for a voucher here in a few minutes. But also financial literacy, that is now a mandate from the state for all ninth graders. The dyslexia legislation that's coming in a year. Third grade reading guarantee, they would not be under those. So all of these unfunded mandates they don't have to follow. And as far as admission or enrollment, they can pick who they want. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, recently there have been questionable marketing attempts on the voucher system. I've heard that in school districts, or my school district in Plain Local, we've heard about critical race theory. We've heard that all kids are still virtual, which is not true. And I'm proud to say in Stark County, all of our schools stayed open through the pandemic. We offered face-to-face learning and we offered virtual learning every day. We never closed a day. These misleading facts are being put out in marketing brochures that are going to my families in my school district. It's false advertising, and it's wrong. We don't do that. We follow Ohio public standards, and we don't do those in our classrooms. We're not teaching gender education. We're not doing those things. That is what they are marketing. So when we talk about choice, we have to define why. Is it because we know the facts, or are we making up some facts? What isn't reported is what the public schools are doing with care teams, wraparound services for all families, mental health counselors, social workers, school community liaisons, success coaches to help kids who are struggling with behaviors in the classroom. After school programming, we still feed kids 12 months a year. And during the pandemic, we fed kids daily or weekly, and we were in neighborhoods in pretty much every neighborhood in Plain Local. We also provide services for autistic students, students that are on IEPs, multi-disabled students that are sitting in our classrooms every day, and we provide services for them. And we do it very well, as do all school districts in Stark County. We don't hear those stories. To me, that's not about choice. That's what we do. That's at the core of public education. We educate all kids. So now, through the backpack bill, how do you qualify for a voucher? And this is probably one of the more interesting avenues we've been down. So a school district or a school building can qualify as being ed choice. So how do you get on that? Well, it's all about state testing. Well, I believe the last 2 years, our kids have learned in some very different ways because of a pandemic. The goals continue to move. I don't know how we hit a goal if it continues to change yearly. State tests have changed over the past years. When I taught, we had proficiency tests, we had PARCC tests. Now we have Ohio State tests. Passing rates change, and they change pretty much every year. And no one can really define how it's all calculated. We have a new state report card coming out next week. By the way, if you're in some of these voucher schools, none of this matters, by the way. So next week we have a state report card coming out, and now we're going to be ranked on a star system. And I will tell you, I was talking to Jeff Talbot earlier tonight, no one will understand the star system, but what they will know is if you have 5 stars, that equals an A. If you have 0 stars, that's an F. So we haven't really gone away from what it's really going to state. The state legislature takes the report card, and education now has become a political discussion point. We see it every night on the news, and we hear it every day on the news. It's now political. Our kids have become political pawns, and that's a shame. And lastly, admissions. Public schools, we take all kids. We don't get to ask. As long as they live in our boundaries, we take them. If you qualify for a school voucher, but let's say, you have some learning disabilities, or maybe, you have some discipline issues, I can turn you away. I don't have to accept you. We're creating 2 systems. We're creating a class system, and it's not good. I was also listening to the testimony, and one of the questions asked was, well, can these kids that take these vouchers, can they ever go back to the public schools? Well, the answer was, well, yeah, they can go back. If we can't meet their needs, they can go back to the public school. And hopefully the public schools have the resources and the dollars to educate them. Thought that was a pretty contradicting statement, because isn't that the whole idea of choice, right? Because they can do it better. Well, if they can go back, and I've seen multiple kids in my school district come back from a private school, charter school, whatever you want to name, and they've been behind. And they haven't received the education that they should have. But yet the public school then is under the accountability to get them caught back up and to make sure that they're learning at the levels that are defined. That's unfair. So I believe public education is the best pathway for kids to experience success in their life. I believe the backpack bill, if passed, will destroy public education. It will. And, 3 to 5 years from now, we'll be looking at a whole different system in Ohio. And I'm very worried about the kids and what's going to happen to them, all kids, no matter where they live, no matter what their parents do, how much money they make, or their race, or their gender, or any of that. I worry about those kids. The reality is the voucher system's misleading to the general public, and again, has become very political. I think the time is now. I never thought I'd see this in my career, but if we don't become vocal and active and advocate for our kids, we're going to lose public education. And I hope your takeaway from tonight is to get involved, to be active, and to educate people. Again, not complaining, but the facts are the facts. And I think we owe it to our community, and more importantly, we owe it to our kids to make sure that we provide them with the best public education possible. Thanks. I knew I would forget. So it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Resnick from the Canton City School Board.
Well, good evening, and I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and I would like to thank the League of Women Voters for again putting on a great program on behalf of something that we all care about, which is public education. Canton City School District, I'm really proud of Canton City School District this evening. Our superintendent, Jeff Talbert, was here. My board colleague, Kim Brown, is here. And we actually have a couple of retired Canton City School teachers here. We have James Carmen, who is a former Canton City School Board member also. And I get a lot of credit that I probably don't deserve for getting the lawsuit against Ed Choice vouchers started. And the truth is, what I really did was run my mouth. But two of the intellectual powerhouses that really made it happen are sitting right here, in Susie Kaeser and Steve Dyer. So I am really honored to be on the dais with them as well. So as we're sitting in my alma mater and one of my favorite places, if not my very favorite place in the Canton City School District, I'm going to tell you a story about how lucky I actually am to have been a Canton City School student. Because when I was about 9 or 10, there was an initiative in this area throughout Northeast Ohio by the people who run the Hebrew day schools in Cleveland Heights. And they got a hold of some money somewhere, and there was a great recruiting drive done in Canton. And they came after me and my brother and my sister. And my mom, I think, was starting to think that it might be a good idea. But it was my dad who coincidentally, would he still be with us today? His birthday is today. But it was my dad who put his foot down and said, and he was a Canton City Schools graduate too, but he said, my kids are not going to a private school. And the reason was, he said, our kids are going to have to make it in a world where not everybody is going to be like the people who attend the Hebrew day schools. He had a great sense of democracy, small d, and of what it takes to negotiate the world full of people who don't look like you, have the same background as you, don't necessarily speak the same language. And that was one of the greatest gifts that my dad gave us. So what my dad really understood at the end of the day, next slide, was this. This is from the Ohio Constitution. We've talked a little bit about the Constitution tonight, so just put it up there. This is Article 6, Section 2, the Ohio Constitution. And it's worth reading. It says, the General Assembly shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as, with the income arising from the school trust fund, will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools. Let me repeat that again. A thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state. But no religious or other sect or sects shall ever have any exclusive right to or control of any part of the school funds of this state. That's still in the Constitution. And the problem is, there are people in the legislature who, if they know it, they don't care. And there are a lot of school board members, unfortunately, throughout the state, who don't know that this exists. Because a lot of school board members get on the school board and they don't get trained, they don't get involved. They're great people and they believe in the right things, but they're not introduced to this. one of my challenges to those of you who are administrators out there is make sure your boards know about this. Almost every state in the union has something very close to that in its constitution, because the founders of our nation and the founders of our state, as Susie pointed out, believed that we needed an educated populace for democracy so that we could all get along and we could all advance. The people who are pushing the private school agenda know that too. They know about this, and they know what public schools can do. And they know why it's important to have public schools. But they come at it from a different side. Next slide, please. So if you go on the website, this is Americans for Prosperity. This is a Koch brothers organization. One of the largest, they're billionaires, one of the largest funders of privatization in the country. And they are in Ohio. I have the link up above, and I've published some of the highlights because I couldn't squeeze it all in. But according to the Americans for Prosperity website, the group is asking Ohio members to, quote, call your school board president and ask him or her to take back their support for the lawsuit. We ask that you pass a resolution stating our school district is not taking a stand in the anti-parents' rights lawsuit, and we ask that Vouchers Hurt Ohio Coalition remove our school district from their website and all other materials. We do not support the lawsuit against Ohioans in this matter. Next slide, please. And there it is. It showed up in Canton Local School District. And it is probably showing up in other districts. They're here. These are billionaire-funded organizations that don't fundamentally believe in democracy, don't value what we value, don't care about things like equity. Their agenda is different. Next slide. Then there's these guys. The Center for Christian Virtue, used to be called Citizens for Community Values. They're also a billionaire-funded organization. They have the Lindner fortune. Lindner, that's Provident Bank, Chiquita Bananas, United Dairy Farmers. Back in my day as a reporter for the now defunct Gay People's Chronicle, I used to cover them a lot because then they were really interested in conservative social issues. They have since gotten a lot of money. Their office moved from Sharonville to right across the street from the State House. And they are flexing their muscle like you can't believe. And they have a new initiative. And I would urge everybody to go to their website too. It's real easy, ccv.org. It's shocking. But they now have an initiative called the Ohio Christian Education Network that is doing a lot in the wrong direction. So their president, Aaron Baer, said on public radio August 12th, said, quote, "There's religious teaching happening in public school right now, indoctrinating kids into Marxism and really dangerous worldviews, so they need to get their religion out of public schools first." He said that. That is now acceptable in the state of Ohio, and it's the dominant point of view in the state legislature. Same interview, he said, and this should shock you, he said, "On every corner that you see a church, we want to see a school as well." This is what's happening. These are billionaire-funded organizations that are reaching into your pockets and funding an anti-democratic agenda that does everything that we in public education know is wrong for the success of our small d democracy. So what do I as a school board member worry about? Well, obviously the funding and the lack of accountability. But when I am asked, why should a school district join the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit and campaign, my first answer is always to protect your local school or your local tax base. Because as it has been pointed out, but I'm going to put a sharper point on it, it is your local taxpayers who are making up the difference when the money from the state is going and diverted to non-public schools. School boards have no other choice at that point but to pass levies and go deeper into the local tax base. And I don't know about, your districts, but Canton City School District doesn't have much farther to reach, quite frankly. I'm also very concerned that as board members, we have a fiduciary duty not just to our taxpayers but also to the institution of public education and to the Ohio Constitution that we swore an oath to protect. And I do have some concern that there are not, that it's not a unanimous view, even among school board members, that this is a very important cause and that this is a very important project that is trying to beat back an existential threat. So I'm going to save everything for questions, and I hope that we get a lot of questions. And again, I thank you all for being here. And with the election season coming up, there's just one other thing I want to say. Ohio has not had a statewide election in a very long time. I mean, we're talking back to the 90s when Steve Dyer was elected. There has not been statewide elections where public school funding, despite being such a huge part of the general revenue fund, there has not been an election where public school funding has been a front and center issue. And most of them, it hasn't been mentioned at all. You can go back 4 years to the DeWine Cordray race, and it was barely mentioned at all. It was a footnote on their website, and nobody talked about it. Nobody asked them about it. Reporters didn't ask them about it. The people didn't ask them about it. So how do we have this conversation in the state of Ohio if we can't even have honest elections where this stuff isn't front and center? And that's where you all come in, and that's where I'm asking for your help, because this really is the threat to our way of life in the state of Ohio. And with that, I'll sit down and we'll take questions, and thank you.
Indeed. Whew, makes my heart go faster. We have a lot of work to do. I have some questions, and I think we're collecting a few other questions in the audience. So please, if you have something you want to add, hand it to the folks there in the aisle. First of all, Brent, this has been directed to you, and the question is, how do you rebut the poor schools argument for vouchers?
Well, what I would say to that is, one is, I think your definition of poor schools will probably have to be defined, and I'm sure everyone has a differing opinion of that. I think when we look at poor schools, there's so many different measures outside of the academic side. There's, all the other things that school districts do, but I think the one aspect that we haven't talked about, or maybe doesn't get as much attention, is how poverty plays a role in that. And I think it's important that we have to get everybody engaged in public school families, communities that will support our kids and our families. There's many, many things we have to figure out. But as far as poor schools, I think if you would go into any of our schools and talk to our parents, one, they don't understand what the state report card is, and two, they want their students to be loved and taken care of and make sure they're safe every day.
Exactly. Steve, do you want to add?
If I could, real quick, a couple years ago, the Cincinnati Enquirer looked at 2 years of test data because one of the things that we passed, in addition to the Fair School Funding Plan, was a requirement that all voucher kids have to take a test so we can have some comparative data. Not that they've done anything with it. But what I can say is that after they looked at 2 years of data, and what they found is in 9 of 10 cases, the public school students did better than the private school students taking a voucher. And in over half of the Big 8, that was true. And I believe Canton was one of those where that was true, but I have to double check that. But again, the whole idea that you need to rescue kids from failing schools and put them in private schools, the schools that are failing are the ones taking the vouchers. If you want to look at it that way, I mean, I have serious issues with judging schools by tests, but if you're going to do that, their argument is they're not doing well on state tests, therefore we need to put them in private schools with vouchers. Private schools, 9 out of 10 times, are doing worse. So, that's my response to it, is they don't do better, they do worse.
Yeah. I'll give this one to Susie. How does funneling money to religious schools not violate separation of church and state?
In my view, it does. It's a serious problem. There was a Supreme Court challenge to vouchers on the basis of the separation of church and state. It was called the Zelwyn case. And it was tried in around 2000, decided in 2002. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, the federal court in Cleveland. That judge was a friend of mine, and he ruled that it was a violation. But when it got to the Supreme Court, they lost. They said, and it was based exclusively on the Cleveland Scholarship Program, and that at that time, there were not very many kids involved in the scholarship program, and they basically ruled that it was religious neutral. But if you look today, if you look at the 1800s vouchers in my community, all but 15 are to a religious school. So the notion that this is not religious, is a problem.
Yeah, and when the Zelman case was decided, it was one program in one school district. They got $2,400 a kid. And Rehnquist, who wrote the opinion, said that, basically it was a scale issue. It was, too small. Yeah, $6-7 million out of, $7-8 billion a year being spent. It didn't affect that many kids. There was a financial disincentive to take the voucher because it was so small. And, we are talking about a whole different animal today. $7,500 a kid is more than what over half of school districts get from state. And that's what a high school voucher is now. And they're just going to up that over and over again. So it's a totally different discussion today when you're talking about a $500 million program versus an $8 million program. But that's, that the Zelman decision did come out of the Cleveland voucher case, but again, it was just limited to the Cleveland voucher program as it existed 5 years after it was founded, which was not very impressive at that point.
But the Supreme Court has continued to support vouchers at the federal Supreme Court, and they continue to remove barriers between church and state.
Which is why the coalition's decided to go the state route.
And isn't trying it on religious grounds.
Okay, here's another question. It isn't specified for any particular person. Are all school choice options required to use state tests to determine student learning?
The charter school students take the same tests as traditional public school students. Voucher students, if you're taking a voucher, you have to take a test, but it's not regulated by the state. It can be an Iowa test or something like that. So it's a little difficult to compare, but they are tested, but there are zero consequences for the voucher kids, whereas there are tons of consequences for school districts. And and the charters are supposed to have some sort of accountability, like if they keep performing poorly, they get closed down. But there's so many loopholes and so many ways to avoid that actually, since 1998, there have only been 24 charter schools that have closed because of academic failure, which is just amazing. We just got rid of the A through F report card system, thank God. But during that time that there was the A through F system, charter schools got more Fs than A's, B's, and C's combined on the state report card. And yet we can't close them down for failure. So
We're operating under such a system of double standards. It's sort of hard to understand or appreciate why anybody in their right mind would see that as good policy.
Indeed.
Or
Brent, did you
fair.
want to add something to that?
No, what I would say is we're not comparing apples to apples. And until we do that, we're not going to be able to, a school district or a building could become a voucher school or a voucher building based on what? Because you can't compare what we're doing with these private schools. So I mean, the conversation is at times humorous because we're not even comparing the same things. But yet we want to tell public schools they're not doing their job, which I think is wrong.
Eric, I'm going to give this one to you, or did you want to make an additional comment?
I just wanted to make just a brief comment on that. Every charter school that operates within the boundaries of the Canton City School District underperforms the Canton City School District. And that is not unique throughout the state of Ohio. If you go to just about any city, I think you would find the same thing. And as Brent said, it's a double standard. And, there are a number of reasons why parents opt for those schools. None of them particularly good. Some of them, when they recruit, for example, you can get things like a $200 Walmart gift card for every student that you have that goes to one of those charter schools is an incentive. Well, if you're a family that's, living below the poverty line and you have 4 students, $800 can be life-changing. Doesn't mean it's a better school, but parents jump on it because it is what it is. Sometimes transportation is an interesting issue where, we have to transport those kids. When I first started on this Board of Education years ago, before we changed our transportation policies, we actually transported more kids to charter schools than we did to our own schools. That's expensive. And that's another thing that just comes right out of our budget. So what happens now is, families will say, well, I want my kid to be on a bus to go to school. Well, that might mean, depending on where they live, if they live real close to a Canton City school, that might mean that, that their only option, if that's really, really important to them, is to go to a charter school. That, again, isn't going to offer the opportunities that we offer and isn't going to perform as well academically. And we're paying for it. The school district is paying for that as well. So it's a very perverted system, and it's very much skewed away from public school districts. I'll stop there and take the question.
We just got one here. What are the teacher qualifications in schools funded by vouchers?
Correct me if I'm wrong, and Steve, you probably know this answer better than I do, but I don't think they are licensed or have to be licensed in all cases.
They don't have to be, but
Yeah.
most of them are.
Most of them are.
They don't have to be.
Yeah, but a lot of like the religious ones, they're, I know of religious schools in this area that are operating without licensed teachers. So, yeah.
The other thing that we haven't really brought up is that all the money that goes to a voucher, that is paid to a voucher school, goes into a budgetary black hole. We can't audit that money. So we've spent $3.6 billion on tuition subsidies, and we don't know how any of that has been spent. And, you know, if you remember the ECOT scandal, which is now approaching $117 million, the biggest taxpayer ripoff in the state of Ohio, it took us 17 years and a public audit every year to finally catch them, although we caught them the first year, but that's a long story. You know, I'm sure there's nothing like that going on in the private system.
We hope. This question's for you, Steve. How can we simplify the Fair School funding plan enough for the public to support it?
You sick of paying property taxes? Pass this plan.
Short and simple.
I like that.
I think you've talked about this a little bit, but maybe we need a little more clarification. How will this experiment in school choice be evaluated? Will it be evaluated?
The short answer is no.
It's been evaluated, and it's miserable. Performance is bad. The effect on, you know, the voucher proponents don't care about the kids until they start making the choice to go to the private option. So they don't care what their programmatic effects are on the 90% of kids who don't exercise those options. So, you know, they don't care about whether kids in public schools have the resources, but they sure care once those kids get to a charter school or they take a voucher. I mean, you should see what the Fordham Institute wants, you know, wants the, you know, private schools to be able to give their kids. And it sounds very familiar to what, you know, Brent wants for his kids. But they don't want that in Brent's school. They want it in the private school. So again, there's, you know, the evaluation of Ohio's charter and voucher system is universally not good.
Laughed at.
And actually, in 2005, there used to be a division of the Legislative Service Commission, which does nonpartisan budget analysis and policy analysis for legislators. And there was a division called the Legislative Office of Education Oversight. And it had started putting out reports because it started being able to track charter schools because it's been, you know, a 5-year program now. And they started putting out report after report after report showing just how miserable these places were. And so just in the dead of night, John Husted, when he was Speaker of the House, just redlined them, got rid of the department, got rid of the LLEO. And so we got rid of that problem. But that's generally what they've done at the legislative level, is if there is any accountability, they get rid of it, and they say we're being more accountable for these schools, and then they just carve a bunch of loopholes so you don't have to worry about it. You know, it's been maddening and frustrating, especially considering how much money we've spent, and if we had actually committed that revenue to fully funding a rationally based school funding model, we could have put this thing to bed 25 years ago.
Exactly.
So both Steve and I are data number crunchers, and some of, for me, was just tracking down the data to show not a qualitative report, but a quantitative report to know the scale of it and who was being affected. And so there's data out there, but my experience with the state's data is that nobody spends time mining it to really evaluate, and mostly that policy makers are not paying attention to the evaluation that is done. So being informed about the data helps you picture, like Steve's graphics are so good at making it real. And I think for a lot of us, until you see those numbers, it's sort of like this is a vague idea, but it's robbing our schools with great amounts of money, and it's robbing our kids of quality education. And so I think a lot of evaluation's been done by outside voices, but not necessarily by the legislators.
So another question that's sort of been discussed, obviously, but just cutting to the chase here. So if the backpack bill is passed, Will that eliminate all state funding for public schools, forcing them to rely on the choosing of these other schools?
It's hard. I don't know. I can't read it.
If it, Brent, you want to take it or you want me? Okay. Well, if it passes, what's going to happen is the vast majority of school districts will get a lot less state aid than what they're currently getting. So it's going to be basically a massive state aid cut for most school districts. It's going to be a massive increase in state aid for privately run charters and vouchers. But, here's the dirty little secret. There aren't enough seats in the private system, and there aren't enough seats in the charter system to handle all the kids who are in the public system. So when they talk about all this money, there aren't magically going to be 1.5 million more seats in the private school system. What they're doing is basically shoveling a bunch of money to subsidize the private school tuitions for parents who have already chosen to send their kids there, and now they're just going to get, they're going to be at the public trough. And that's what's going to happen. So it's going to be a windfall for people who have decided to send their kids to private school, and it's going to be at the expense of the 90% of parents who keep their kids in the public schools. And that's just they're going to be massive budget shortfalls for school districts, and you're going to be looking at 15, 20 mil levies in some districts. They're just not going to pass, and then I don't know what will happen.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
we have,
Go ahead.
to make it a little more real as far as numbers go, in Plain, we get almost $3,000 from the state for every student. So that'll go away. And, so the budget shortfall Steve talks about, well, it has to be made up somewhere. So we're going to be going back to the property owners and asking for more money. And in Plain local, there's 80%, if not more, of our population do not have kids in the school district. So it's going to be harder and harder to pass levies. And the other thing is, when they say, well, we'll send them back, and you can, again, hear the testimony, we'll send them back to the public schools. They have the resources and the dollars to better educate those kids. From where? Where's that money going to come from? So our taxpayers are going to be completely confused about where the money is, where it's going, and the money isn't going to be following the kid. And, to go back on the accountability, we have an audit every year. Public schools have an audit every year. And we have 7 federal audits coming now through ESSER funding. There is so much accountability that we have as a public institution that these schools don't have. And it's a crime, quite honestly.
It is. There are 2 important questions before we run out of time altogether that I think we need to be sure people know about. First of all is, how do we learn to promote where legislators stand and vote on this issue, and to be informed on our votes? And then following up on that, how do we follow the progress of the lawsuit? So I think if we can wrap up with those 2 points, that would be helpful to our audience.
Well, I'll speak to being an informed voter, and that is the League of Women Voters does a great job of doing candidate forums. Now, we know many of the people standing for office now are both refusing to participate in the surveys of all candidates and don't show up for public events. So I guess you have to call them. You just have to call them. You have to find out where they stand. And then you need to write the letter to the editor about what that conversation was. Because if they're not going to come to you, you have to go find them. And I just think we have to dog candidates until they speak to this.
I'd like to add to that, and then I'll take the last question. But I think a lot of it goes to your local news media, which, by the way, is really hollowed out too, for some of the same reasons that school districts are being defunded, and who owns them and what their motives are. But at the end of the day, we can't continue to have elections, statewide elections in this state, and not talk about public education given that it's such a huge percentage of the general revenue fund. I'll tell just a brief story. In 1998, I was on the professional staff of the Mary Boyle for U.S. Senate campaign. And we had polling that was showing that education funding, this was when DeRolf was still a more front and center issue than it is now, but we had polling that was showing that public school funding was far and away the most important issue on Ohio voters' minds. So here we were, a U.S. Senate campaign, running advertisements on TV talking about school funding. The gubernatorial candidate on the Democratic side that year was Lee Fisher, who had been in the legislature but had some very poor votes on education funding, so he couldn't speak to those issues. He brought in John Walsh, his friend from that TV show, and they talked about child protection. That does, and of course, George Voinovich didn't talk about it at all either, but that does a disservice to every Ohioan, because that's how we have these conversations. That's how we as a state tell our legislators and our executive branch officials what we want. And the system, the way things work, is that those conversations right now are not happening at all. So I would add to Susie's comment that you have to get to the point where reporters are asking the questions of the gubernatorial candidates especially, but also the legislative candidates. They have to start going on the record. We have in Stark County, we have one of the biggest defiances of term limits, that you'll find anywhere, right here in this county. And neither of those guys, neither of them have answered a question about public education funding in a long time, even though Scott Olsleger chairs the House Finance Committee. And they have not talked about public school funding in a very, very long time. That is where the conversation needs to start. And we all have some responsibility for that.
Just, as you mentioned, Olsleger. Olsleger was the only member of the House that's a Republican who voted for the evidence-based model in 2009. So,
yeah,
he's a guy you would think would want to talk about it. But
yeah. But to answer the last question on the, and maybe this isn't the last question, but to answer the question about how do you follow the vouchers, see me if you're not already on the Vouchers Hurt Ohio email list. I will get you on the mailing list. Hopefully the news will cover developments. I don't guarantee it. Right now the lawsuit is sitting in Franklin County, and there's a motion, the state's motion to dismiss is before the judge. The state that's always their first defense, is they file a motion to dismiss. But there's an intervener. The judge allowed, and I can't remember the name. Steve, do you remember the name of the intervener offhand?
it's the same group out of Notre Dame that fought, that got Roe overturned.
Yeah, so the judge allowed them to intervene on behalf of the state. And I don't know why the state even allowed this, because their real goal is to slow things down and make things more expensive. But nonetheless, they're there. Well, they have intervened and put a motion before the judge that's making the process go a little slower. They want oral arguments on the state's motion to dismiss. So currently, as of today, we are waiting for the judge to rule on their motion for oral arguments so that she can then rule on the state's motion to dismiss. The lawsuit was filed in January. So It's a slow process. It's a fascinating process. It's going to go on for years. And the other danger, by the way, while I'm thinking about this, is the problem is that vouchers and this increase in vouchers and increase in money that's going to vouchers isn't going to stop until the judge and the courts say it has to stop. So all this intervening time, you know, that the works is gummed up in the courts, and this is why the intervener is there, is that the state legislature is just going to do whatever they want anyway. So, you know, in some ways, the slowness of the process is benefiting the wrong side.
Yeah.
That's actually why the intervener is there. But
Okay, I think
that's where it is.
We need to end there, and we thank you for that, Eric. I feel like I've learned a lot. I imagine all of you have. Let's thank our panelists. And of course, I have a few things that I want to say here as we wrap up. We're grateful to the use of this space. We're grateful to all of you who have come tonight to share and learn and to try to figure out how can we help our public schools. I mentioned earlier that we're a nonprofit organization, the League of Women Voters, and so our education fund is a tax-exempt organization. But our work, like all nonprofits, depends on contributions from people like you. So if you want to help us in our work of making democracy work, we hope you'll contribute by dropping a few bucks in the basket back there or taking an envelope to send back a check. And of course, we'd love to have you as members. It is not exclusively an all-female organization. As you know, we have one of our gentleman who's a member of our organization back here, Mr. Elsass, and we're very grateful for everyone who has belonged to us. We are going to be holding another forum in October on bail reform. Bail reform is going to be on the ballot this fall, and so this is going to be a forum in the shape of hearing both sides and understanding the issue more thoroughly and what your yes vote might be versus a no vote on that ballot issue. So I would really urge you to come October 13th, same room, same time. And finally, I would recommend that all of you urge your family and friends to be sure they're registered to vote this fall and that they vote. You know, it's not enough to be registered. You got to go to the polls. We have 3 levels of opportunity. There's a statewide school board seat in this district, I believe, that's going to be up for grabs. So you need to find out what does that opposing candidate stand for. Is he someone who's going to support public schools? There's the state Supreme Court. And we have one member that's going to be going off because of her age, and so there are people that are vying for those roles. Learn about your state Supreme Court members, because justices are extremely important to all of this, as we have learned this year in our gerrymandering issues. And of course, there's legislatures. So please do study up, use Vote 411. We've left palm cards out there so that you can learn where you can get information. And as Eric said, you can get onto that website that shares more about the lawsuit. Yes.
Yeah, the website is vouchershurtohio.com.
Vouchers.
And just one more thing. Ultimately, this lawsuit will be decided by the Ohio Supreme Court. So it does matter who sits on that court. Vouchershurtohio, all one word, .com.
And with that, I thank you all again and have a good drive home.